said, how do we communicate with impact in a world that seems to be evolving so constantly, especially the modes of communication? I know you all have an idea of my profile, so I'm not going to repeat all of that. But I'm just going to say that I've been working in the field of communications for more than 2 decades now. I work with corporates, I work with in the social sector, I've worked with really big organizations, and I'm managing a really tiny project right now. So a diversity of organizations as well as the kind of, the size of organizations that I work with. But the one thing that remains constant across all of these is the need to communicate. Obviously, for the organization, if it has an external audience with the external audiences, but also within the organization. The organization is only as successful as the people that make it. So for interpersonal communication within the organization. Some of you might still be in college, some of you might have just joined the workforce, and others might be in it for a while. And you'll all realize, I hope, that how important communicating effectively is, irrespective of where you are in life right now. And of course, I mean, the form of communications, the different forms by which we communicate has changed very rapidly in the last, let's say, 2 decades. Some of you won't, of course, you're too young to even remember a time without cell phones and social media, etc. And I know I date myself and I say that when I started working, we used to use fax machines for sending press releases to journalists. I can bet my last dollar that a lot of you don't even know what a fax machine looks like, right? But you can Google that after the presentation and see what it was. But it changed very, very quickly from that to emails, to mobile phones, to almost all official business being conducted over WhatsApp, over obviously Zoom and Google Meet, etc. But I have here's something for you to think about. I mean, the forms of communication have changed a lot and will keep changing. But I think the basis of what is good communication versus bad communication has actually not changed that much as we imagine it has. So with that in view, let's just get into ask ourselves a simple question of what does communication really mean at its simplest? It means two people or two entities talking to each other, trying to convey something either through language. Right now, I'm speaking in English, you all understand English. I could, for instance, switch to sign language if I knew sign language and if you understood sign language. So it's an agreed upon, I mean, we all agree what this sign means, for instance, right? We know it means good. So it's a universal sign that all of us understand. English is a language we have in common right now. I'm sure there are other languages right now in this group that are in common. So it's an agreed upon sign or language in which one person tries to convey something and the other person tries to understand it, right? Now, is all communication effective? Very simple answer, no, it isn't. Because what I might think I'm saying, you might be hearing something very different, right? So the key point to take away from here is that communication is not a one-way street, it's a two-way street. Unless both the person who's speaking and the person who's listening engage actively in it, it's going to be ineffective. There's going to be miscommunication. So, and I feel that communication is forever a sort of a work in progress, and we're always trying to get better at saying what we are. But the listener also has to be actively engaged in what they are hearing, and only then will some information, some knowledge, ideas will be communicated with each other. What does the digital age, what is communicating in the digital age, what has it done to all of us, right? And how we think and how we communicate. It's ironic because we now have so many more means of communicating with each other. And newer means being invented pretty much every other day, right? But I think ironically, we're communicating less. We're talking at each other. We're not really talking with each other. Any of you who spent any time on social media, and I'm sure each of you has some social media presence, you know exactly how the conversation devolves very quickly into just an argument. We're just trying to convince somebody else. They're trying to convince us without really understanding each other. So we're not going to go into the whole etiquettes and of the social media, etc. That requires many other presentations probably, but we are going to focus on some of the tools that will help us communicate better in both our professional and perhaps some personal lives, right? So let's now this is something that each one of you needs to answer for yourself. Do you need to communicate more effectively? If all around us people are communicating just by shorthand, right, by emojis, which I don't have anything against, but if that's sufficient for your personal as well as your professional life, then maybe this is something that you don't need, right? Personally, I feel that better communication means that we are better equipped to deal with the world. And this isn't just a feeling I have, right? I mean, this doesn't just come from 20 odd years of having spent my time in this industry. There's hard science behind this. So we know the difference between soft skills and hard skills, right? Hard skills are a person's IQ, for instance, or what their academic achievements are, or what their training is. And of course, those are important, right? But there are studies that show that hard skills versus soft, and communications falls in the soft skills bracket, but there are studies that show that your soft skills actually account for 85% of your success in your chosen career, and only 15% is attributed to what you're trained as, how good you were in school or are in college, and what your IQ level is. So this, again, this need to communicate effectively is backed by science. And the smaller question then on, can one learn to communicate more effectively? The simple answer is yes. The longer and the harder answer is that it doesn't happen overnight. You're not at the end of this hour suddenly going to be better communicators. I've spent 20 years doing this, but I don't consider, I know what my weak points are. So it's constantly a work in progress. And I've worked with some of the top CEOs in the world, and believe me, I mean, they're constantly working at it. The people who are good communicators are those who constantly practice being good communicators, right? But there are some techniques that can help us leapfrog a little bit. And if you practice those regularly, you might notice a change in how you communicate and how effective that is. So we're just going to go right into that. Each one of these, I'm going to talk about 9 specific techniques for effective communication. Each one of these might have other sub-points. You're welcome to take notes. I don't like doing presentations with a lot of text because I feel that's distracting. So if you want to take notes, that's great. And I know this meeting is being recorded. That can be shared, of course, with you later. And you're very welcome to ask me questions at the as well as later on LinkedIn or on my email, just putting it out there so you don't feel stressed in absorbing all of this information. It's a lot. So what's the first technique that might help us? Presuming positive intent. What does this really mean? I could also simply say be positive, right? But that sounds a little superficial. What do I mean by this? And you might think that you're already doing this, but think about a conversation that you've recently had, either at home, in college, at your workplace. And think, I mean, especially if it was a conversation that you were not anticipating. Think how did you feel? I mean, let's say your boss stopped you in the middle of something you were doing, or somebody in college gave you feedback you actually hadn't even asked for. Does your brain unconsciously and immediately say, oh my God, why is this person doing this, right? Why are they trying to interfere in whatever I'm doing? Just think about it, or in mind the next time you're having a conversation with somebody. You have to consciously practice doing that you presume positive intent on that person's behalf. And just kind of tell yourself consciously, this person is coming to me with a positive intent. I'm going to hear them like that. Over time, you might discover some people actually don't come to you with positive intent, but you'll be able to tell the difference at least, right? And you're listening to them with this intent of, I'm going to be a good listener, and then I will respond, whether it's right now or it's later. Yeah, this is the key to having a constructive conversation, and the keyword there being constructive conversation. if you presume positive intent, over time, you will also realize when other people are not presuming positive intent on your part. And that's something that we then get into, how you give feedback and how you take feedback. But this is something that I find immensely helpful. I used to have a little tag on my desk saying positive intent, just to remind myself that frequently when people would just stop by for a chat, that I should presume positive intent on their part, because this did come naturally to me. What does cultivate curiosity mean? I think this is a very innate human trait. We all love stories, we all love telling stories, and we all love hearing stories. Some of us are naturally more curious than others. For some, for those of us where this comes naturally, wonderful. For others who have to cultivate it, this is part of you being a more active listener and expressing more empathy to the person who's telling you something. So cultivate this curiosity. Ask people about themselves. There are three things you can do to express where the other person sees you as more curious and interested in them. One is show enthusiasm. Right? This is by tone of voice. This could be smiling. Again, this is something that some people do naturally. They're more sort of expressive talkers. They smile more. Their tone of voice is more bubbly. For others, I'm not saying you should change who you are, not at all, but just by verbally and through your body language, express more enthusiasm when you're listening. It shows that you're a more active listener. The other thing is a little harder to do. The second thing, it's for a minute, forget your story. I also like to call this suspend your ego. So let's say you meet, you're talking to a coworker or a friend, and that person has just had an interesting experience, and they're telling you about it. So we listen to them, sometimes patiently, sometimes not, and then the minute they stop, our instinct is to say, "Oh my God, the same thing happened to me," right? And then to top that story that they've just told with an even wilder, even more interesting story that has happened to us. This is a very human thing to do, but sometimes you need to. I think the best conversationalists are those who can curb that instinct at least for a little while and ask questions of the other person about their story. There will be a time and place for you to share your story perhaps later, but at that moment, that person is sharing a part of themselves with you. Be curious about that and their experience. And then perhaps later you talk about your story, right? The third point is actually related to this in asking open-ended questions. What's the difference between open-ended questions and close-ended questions? Close-ended questions usually have an answer of yes or no, right? Open-ended questions generally start with why, how, what. Simple tricks to remember. Let me give you an example. At the end of this session, hopefully we'll have time for it, and I will ask you for feedback on this, right? If I ask you a question which is simply, was this presentation useful to you? One, the answer could be a simple yes, no. But what do we gain from it? Both you, all of you, and I, what do we gain from it? I mean, one, I'm putting you on the spot. And being polite people, you might feel that you're being forced to say, yes, this was useful, right? Even if some of you are honest and you actually didn't find anything useful in it, if you say no, one, it kind of ruins my day because I then keep thinking, oh my God, this wasn't useful to people. But also, what do I gain from it? I learn nothing from it, right? I simply get that yes and no. If instead of that close-ended question, I ask you, so what did you find useful about this session? Or what would you have liked to hear more about? Then I actually get something from it. You get something from it. You've been an active listener. You express what you felt was what you gain from this, and you get a chance to express yourselves. And I actually get something from that feedback where next time I incorporate that feedback into my presentation. So that's the open-ended questions versus close-ended. The next point is related to what we just talked about, is paying attention to both your body language as well as somebody else's. Your body language should express interest, enthusiasm, right? How do you do this? one of the easiest techniques is to mirror the person that you're talking to, right? If or in a larger gathering, if this presentation were happening in person, then I'm the speaker and you're in a large room. So mirroring, if I'm smiling and you smile back at me, then I know you're interested, right? In a one-to-one or an in-person smaller gathering, you mirror the person who's speaking. If they lean forward, you lean forward a little, right? If their tone suddenly turns a little serious, you don't kind of grin at them. I mean, the way you look is serious. These seem like very natural, very normal things to do. But so all I'm telling you is to be more conscious of a lot of this, right? Making eye contact with the person that you're talking to, whether you're speaking or they're speaking. This is again a little easier for some people than it is for others. So don't see what your comfort level is. If you find making eye contact on a sustained basis harder, then supplement that with nodding, perhaps asking questions, paying attention to what the other person is saying in different ways, right? I mean, if they're making a joke, perhaps smiling at it. It doesn't, eye contact is something that we build a comfort level with gradually. And some people find it easier than others do. So you don't have to push yourself out of your comfort level too much. We might feel empathy for somebody who's speaking, right? I mean, we might identify with something they're saying, but we need to verbalize it. We just talked about how we mirror somebody's body language, but how do we verbalize empathy with them, saying that we understand what you're saying? You express approval, right? I'm not talking about in the workplace compliments on people's appearance. That's superficial. If you feel comfortable enough, if you're close enough to somebody to offer a compliment, do that. But what I mean is expressing approval for something that goes beyond that superficial, right? For instance, if somebody has just sent an email to the organization and you think that they express themselves well, a simple thing saying, hey, I really liked how concisely you presented that information. Or I really liked how you answered questions in the presentation or the team meeting that we just did. These are simple things, but they have to be honest. You can't make that up. Somebody can't have had a disastrous presentation in front of an office or in class, and you say, "No, you were wonderful," right? I mean, these have to be honest because the other person will know when you're being honest with these. A very, very simple thing to do is in a conversation, mention the other person's name. Do this frequently, but not too frequently, because then it sounds like you're trying too hard. Just remember, especially in cases where the other person's name is unfamiliar, they're from a culture where names are different, it's all right to ask even more than once, to note it down in phonetically, rather than get it wrong and assuming how the name is said, but just using somebody's name. It makes them feel heard and seen. Another simple thing, and you will notice this in offices, in workplaces, or in other professional settings, especially, is people who use the singular I versus the plural we. The best managers that I remember are people who always use the we. We did this, right? And some of the managers that in my memory, don't have such a great, don't have such a positive association for me, are people who stood in large gatherings and said, I did this. Whereas even the people listening to them, or certainly the team that had worked on it, knew that it was a team effort. It's perhaps something they did unconsciously. So be more conscious about this, especially as you grow in an organization. A lot of organizational conflict or interpersonal conflict simply comes from the fact that we're all insecure about ourselves, our positions, right? So when you keep emphasizing on the we, you're just consciously and unconsciously reminding everybody that you're working towards the same goal, that you're all in it together. This seems a little contradictory to what I said earlier about suspending your ego and letting somebody else tell their story. But as I said then, there's a time and place for everything. Be open about yourself. People like others who humanize themselves, right? You don't have to overdo this. Again, all of us have different comfort levels about what we share. Don't overshare. But people like knowing who they're dealing with. I mean, so simple things like, about yourself. I mean, what your interests are, where you studied, or what you like. These are simple things that make you more human, and also help the other person be more open about themselves and to get to establish a certain trust with each other. Again, if you've in different workplace circumstances, this is a very common thing, right? I mean, somebody's just sent you an email or given you something that's 5 pages long and you just can't process it. Don't be that person. Try to avoid this information overload on people. Sometimes it's unavoidable. Let's say you're changing jobs and you need to hand over your job to somebody who's just joined. So it's unavoidable. You're compelled to dump a lot of information on them, but then try to at least mitigate that by acknowledging that you're dumping a lot of information on them, saying that you're available for questions, perhaps even after the job has transitioned, depending on whether that's true for you or not, and just acknowledging that this is a hard thing, and you'll try to simplify it for them in whatever time that you have with them. Using humor, right? I mean, some of the best speakers you may have heard use humor to deliver a message. But this comes with a little bit of a warning. Do not put somebody else down with humor. Never ever put yourself down with humor either. Obviously, no off-color jokes, preferably anywhere, but in your personal life, that's your business. But not in professional settings, right? And don't ever tolerate that from anybody else either. That's something, especially women tend to do, right? I mean, a lot of people make off-color jokes, and we're used to just saying sort of ha-ha and moving on. So you don't have to take that. But when you're using humor, it can be something simple. I mean, for instance, any new organization I join, the first birthday we celebrate, I tell people that I can't hold a tune even when we're singing happy birthday. It's not something big, but it's something that just makes me feel more human. And also it's kind of fair warning to people that do not ask me to join in any singing that they do. So self-deprecating humor can be useful, but don't put yourself down for anybody. This one is a personal problem for me, and I have not been able to conquer it at all. It's filler words. It's saying ah. It's saying yeah, like, you know. We all have these favorite words or these filler words that we throw in whenever we're speaking. You can only eliminate these with practice. For me, it's a constant work in progress. If any of you find an easy way to do this, please get back to me. But yeah, I mean, the lesser filler words you have in your conversation, the more confident you sound, obviously. This last one that I brought in as an example earlier is feedback. It doesn't have to be for every single conversation, right? I mean, if you meet at the water cooler or while you're getting chai with somebody, you don't have to then say, oh, give me feedback on what I just said, obviously. But request feedback, I mean, for something important from people whose judgment you trust. Not just people who think who you're friends, but people who you know are going to be honest with you, who are going to give you constructive feedback and sort of feedback that you can use to make yourself better. I'm just going to pause here for maybe a couple of minutes and take my own advice and just ask people if they have any questions so far in what we've covered so far, and then we'll continue from here. Asba, please, I can't see everybody because I've got so if anybody raises their hand, please help moderate that.
Sure, ma'am. So we are opening to 1 or 2 questions. Anyone can go ahead and raise their hands. So we have one question in the chat box as well. So yeah, Sabah. So the question is how to make a career like a communication trainer or a soft skill coach. It's from Yasmin Shah.
Thank you for that, Yasmin. I don't know what you're studying currently, but you don't. There are different courses and different trainings that help you become a trainer or do a course in communications. You don't have to, if you've done your graduation or your master's, for instance, in a different subject, that doesn't have to stop you from becoming a communications coach. There are different courses that will offer you this. If you have a certain aptitude to communications, there's so much also material just available. One of the good things about the digital age is that there's so much material available online. But you can go into a little bit of a rabbit hole in that and not know what information is useful, what is not. I would suggest you look up courses. If you're doing something else right now, whether working or whether you're a full-time student, see if there are courses that you can do part-time. Make sure that those courses come either recommended by somebody you know or come with good feedback from the community. So absolutely, I mean, you can, I would suggest doing a course and reading up first on what you want to do, what is that specific thing that draws you to it, and then seeing how you upskill yourself. There is no particular qualification needed to get into communications. Most people I know who made a career out of communications came from very diverse backgrounds. They've been engineers, they've studied history, they've been sports people. It's just that they've had this sort of wanting to be where they felt they had a certain aptitude for communicating well and they wanted to share that with other people. One of the things you do not need, and this is something that I've heard in so many interviews, is why do you want to be a communicator or why do you want to get into communications? A lot of people say because I like people. You don't have to. I don't like interacting with people, and I've been in communications for 20 years, and I know a lot of people who don't necessarily like to network, etc., but who have made successful careers out of being in communications. I hope that helps somewhat, Yasmin. If there are further questions or if you want more detailed answers, connect with me on LinkedIn and I'll share my email at the end of the presentation.
Okay, so Sabah, we have another question as well, and it's from Samreen. So Samreen is like, what are some of the mistakes you've been seeing? Like you are in this field and you see youngsters, students, or professionals doing some of the mistakes. So what will be some of the red flags you would like to tell us to tell them, ki, okay, stop doing this?
Okay, this is actually, I feel like Samreen is reading my mind or she's somehow seen my presentation because the next section actually I've put in specifically for this. So I'm just going to go into that and Samreen, that will hopefully answer part of your question. And then if it hasn't, I'll address that. This next part is actually about written communication, right? I feel like this is an art that we're losing. And I see this a lot, especially with people who message me on LinkedIn or resumes that I've seen over the years or emails I get from younger people. So I'm not trying to be ageist here, but I feel like because most of us now are used to short form communication, we don't pay a lot of attention to just what we're writing and how it sounds to the person who's reading it, right? So I've got 4 simple things to say to pretty much everybody on how this can be better, and they're very simple things. One is just keep it simple. Don't go into a rambling thing of what you're trying to say. Just keep it simple. If something can be said in 2 sentences, you don't need 15 sentences to say it. And if something can be said using simple words, just do that rather than using convoluted sentence structure and words which just sound fancy but actually mean the same thing as a simple word would do. Be polite, especially if you're reaching out to people out of the cold, right? I mean, you're just messaging somebody or you've got their email ID from somewhere or somebody has referenced you and you don't know whether to be formal or informal. Always err on the side of caution and be formal. This doesn't necessarily mean that you have to address somebody as sir and ma'am. That's not what I mean at all, right? But being polite is different, or doesn't just encompass that, right? It's the tone of how you write. If you're writing a professional email, especially to somebody for the first time, maybe let's not start it with hey. Maybe it can just be dear Sabah. It doesn't even necessarily have to be dear Miss Hamid. It can just be dear Sabah. That's perfectly fine in a professional thing, but maybe don't say hi or hey, right? It's not something, it's again this unconscious thing that the person who's receiving it, their brain does. They process it as somebody more professional versus less professional. So now, this is again one of those things, I mean, be consistent. If you've called me Miss Hamid in the first line, then just call me Miss Hamid throughout the email. If you've called me Sabah in the first line, then call me Sabah throughout. If, for instance, you've used American spelling for part of the email, then just continue using American spelling. Don't suddenly switch between British spelling and American spelling. It's not something, it's something both my conscious and my unconscious brain registers. But that unconscious part that immediately, for instance, when I'm looking at resumes, it immediately sort of slots these resumes into more professional, less professional, irrespective of what the qualification on paper may be. Check for errors and then check again because there may be something that you've missed. Again, one of those things that I personally, these things over here, I mean, the 4 things over here are purely from my experience in dealing with people and how I process this. If you have an important email to send, if you have a report to send, once it's ready, don't just hit send right then. Maybe take a break for 5 minutes, come back to it, see if there are any errors in it, and invariably there will be. Right? Even with word spell check, even with automatic things doing your work for you, there may be other errors in it that it hasn't caught, and you need to. Sometimes things are urgent. You know, somebody's asking you for information on WhatsApp, or you need an urgent email to send. But spend 5 seconds, spend 10 seconds, and just reading that again. It'll be less costly in the long run if you catch that error now rather than hit send and then say, oh my God, I made this mistake. So yeah, these are some of the things that that I would advise everybody, not just young people, but everybody to keep in mind if they're trying to present a professional image. Asma, were there any more questions in the previous section? Otherwise, I'll move on to the last section of the presentation.
Yeah, so we have a few questions. It's about should we avoid hey or hi in the mail?
If it's somebody you're writing to for the first time, yes. If it's somebody that you know well and you've worked with, right? I mean, if you're writing to a coworker and you both know each other very well, then hey or hi is fine because you've established a rapport. They know you and they know your work. So you have to use your judgment in who you're writing to and how well you already have an established relationship.
So ma'am, we have another question. How can we avoid filler words? Because for me, it come automatically even when my own understanding. It's from Salwa.
I told you, I don't really know the answer to this one. Practice. If you have an important presentation, maybe record yourself, maybe speak in front of the mirror. Recording yourself is a good thing. Or if there's somebody that you trust to be your sounding board, do the presentation in front of them and see how they, I mean, perhaps they don't need to interrupt you every time you say like or you know, but they can tell you at the end that you did that quite often. Do it again. So it's just practice that'll help eliminate those. We use these words when we stumble, right? I mean, so if you already know that you're going to be talking about something and you're very confident of the content and you've practiced it a couple of times, then those filler words will be lesser. I don't know if one can completely eliminate those, and everybody sort of accounts for that. But yeah, I think practice is the only way.
And yeah, and
All
ma'am,
right.
oh
Oh,
yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
Yep. So, ma'am, the question is the art of getting calm when you see aggressive people around you in a panel, in a meeting, etc., or sometimes when you are targeted because of any reason. So, how can we do that?
Yeah, this is obviously, hopefully, this is not happening consistently. If it's happening consistently, perhaps the place isn't really is what we in New Age, say a toxic workplace. So hopefully this is something that has happened once or twice. It's not happening again. If you feel targeted personally consistently, then you need to talk to somebody about it, your manager. But if it's your manager doing it, then perhaps somebody in HR. But if it's just if it's just an instance that's happened once or so, you have to remind yourself what you're going to get with engaging with that. Is it, you talked about targeting, let's leave that aside for a second. If it's just people getting aggressive and it's a very aggressive sort of meeting, do you need to engage in it, right? Can you just sort of stay on the sidelines of it, talk to people later? If you're being targeted personally, then either you say, I feel that this is not constructive feedback, or this is not constructive at this moment. I'm going to walk away from this, and we will talk about this when you're calm. You have the choice to walk away from it. It becomes harder if, let's say, it's your manager and you report to them and they're being really aggressive towards you. And you don't know how to respond because there's a lot of conflicting emotions about this is your job, right? It's your manager, so how will they retaliate if you respond to them? One, it's there's clearly nothing to be gained in your being aggressive in return, right? Unless they're being so aggressive that you have, or you feel threatened physically, where you have no option but to kind of shut that down and just run away. But if they're being if they're saying something, if they're giving you feedback which you feel is unfair, you need a little distance from it. Perhaps at that moment you say, and I know it's very hard to say, I will think about this, can I get back to you? Yeah, and then absorb that. Perhaps talk to somebody else who you know is more supportive, more impartial, and discuss this feedback with them, and then go back to the person who's who's been aggressive with you. Basically, at that point, the idea, whether you're one-to-one or whether there are other people, is to diffuse the situation. You ask yourself, what do I gain by losing my calm in this? And sometimes the best thing to do is to just remove yourself from that situation and then address it later. All right, I see we're at 11:43. I'm just going to go into the next section. I'd wondered whether we'd be able to do this in breakout rooms, but I don't think we have the time for that. And also, I thought it would be useful if we had, it would be possible to do it if we had maybe 20, 25 participants. I'm very happy to see more participants here, but I'm going to take you through this next section. Which is the elevator pitch. And perhaps what we can do is, this is something, think of this as sort of homework. I'm sorry to be dumping more stuff on you to do, but there's no time bound thing. And for those of you who are interested in doing this for yourself, feel free to reach me on LinkedIn or get my email from Asba, and I will be happy to give you one-on-one feedback for this, okay? All right, how many of you know what an elevator pitch is? Okay. All right. I can't see all the participants. Are there many hands or few hands?
So, ma'am, we have a few answers in the chat box, and they are like brief
Okay.
introduction of ourselves.
Yeah. That's very correct, Bushra and Shagla. Yeah. All right. So very simply, the elevator pitch is, the elevator comes from the lift. Elevator is a very American word for it, but elevator pitch sounds a little more elegant than lift pitch, right? I mean, that's a little confusing. So which is why in common communications parlance, we call this the elevator pitch. Now think of it as where the term comes from is simply, let's say you're stepping into a lift, into an elevator, and you realize the other person in it is somebody that you idolize, somebody for whose company you want to work, or somebody you admire, their work you admire. And you have this opportunity of, exactly until the elevator reaches the floor you have to get off at, so let's say about 60 seconds, to introduce yourself. So how do you introduce yourself in exactly those 60 seconds. Now, obviously, the elevator thing doesn't always have to be an elevator. So think of this in terms of all the networking we do. There are different professional forums that you're at, whether it's a new office you've joined, whether you're going to a new college, or whether you've just shifted roles there, or you're at a larger gathering where people from other organizations are present, and you give them your card or you introduce yourself and you say, "Hi, my name is Asba." And then what? I mean, in 60 seconds, how do you introduce yourself in a way that they remember? They're meeting 20 other people, but how do they remember you? Or how are you one of the people that they remember? So what the elevator pitch content should cover is who you are, a little background about you. Sometimes a little more context is helpful. So let's say Asba was introducing herself and she would say, "Hey, I know you're a LedBy alum." Or she would say, I've been through your profile and I know we both went to the same college or something, but this is an optional. If there is no more context to share, then don't go into it. Make the connection. Right? I mean, what are you trying to say to them? Be upfront about that. And very importantly, what is it that you want from them? What is your ask of them? So do you want an opportunity to work in that company? Do you want to meet them and talk about something? Just don't be shy about this. Ask about this. Ask politely. And then the closeout. I mean, say, "Thank you very much for your card. I will email you, or I will call up the administration in your office," or whatever that closeout is. So you know what the action is that you have to take afterwards. And what you have to remember is that the content is only part of it. How do you deliver this elevator pitch? And this is where the homework bit comes in. You have to practice this. You can do it in front of the mirror. You can record yourself. Recording yourself is a good way of seeing it yourself until you get it right. There are three components to anything, not just an elevator pitch: the verbal, what you say; the vocal, how you say it; and the visual, how you deliver something. Okay. And what do we mean by the verbal, the vocal, and the visual, right? I just talked about this, but you can look at this in detail and say, okay, the vocabulary you use, the vocal is the tone that we talked about, right? And how you pace yourself, what your volume is like. And then the visual, of course, is, are you standing up straight? Are you maintaining eye contact? Are you overusing gestures like I sometimes tend to do? And this is what the surprising part is that, oops, sorry, press 2. What you say, the content of what you say registers. This is again backed by science. This is not me saying it. The content that you use registers with the listener, makes an impact, 7% of the time. How you say it is far greater at 38%. And very, very interestingly, the visual of what you present, how you're talking to them, is 55%, right? And this is true of any interaction we have in pretty much our lives. Right? I mean, you might have noticed this even in interpersonal relationships, where you're saying something which is you think is fairly reasonable, but the other person is saying, "But I don't like the way you're saying it, or the way you're looking at me," or you were just dismissive in your tone, or you kind of made this gesture that was dismissive. That's where these are unconscious cues that we absorb and also transmit. So remember the thing about being both a listener and the speaker. If you think of yourself as the listener and how you see people, you'll become a better speaker as well. I'm going to stop here. That's a lot of things that we've just gone through. And this elevator pitch thing, since we can't do it here, feel free to record it, send it to me, and I can give you feedback. I'll let Asba know what the last state, how long I can do this. Yeah, I'll give her a date for this, and then please feel free to ask me for feedback on this. All right.
Yeah, sure, ma'am. And yeah, now we are moving to